Hey folks, of course this is a guitar themed channel or a musical instrument themed channel, and a lot of us play, although we talk about models and makes. Uh, Occasionally I do a video about players, and it's all very subjective, who we like. I've put out quite a few videos over the years about different guitarists. They're not as well watched as the instrument videos, but still, I think there are a number of people that are interested in how we evaluate guitarists across at least our contemporary period. And, I always see a list when it comes out because I think it's interesting. And I always note that the lists are always very similar. So when I came across the 2023 greatest guitar players list from Guitar World, I was surprised to see that they had a different number one than most of these lists go for. The number one, as per Guitar World of this year, greatest guitar list, is Brian May. And normally he doesn't make the top five, so that was kind of surprising. And you can kind of see why he's evaluated so high. It's not necessarily his technique, although he does have a sound that is all his own. When you hear a Brian May piece, you know it's him. He's very distinct, probably because he plays a handmade guitar and has a unique tone that there's been a lot written and filmed about. And also, he produced sort of mini guitar symphonies in a lot of the great Queen classics. I'm thinking of the brass band sort of lead in Lizzie on a Sunday Afternoon, which is just absolutely fantastic. I don't see other guitar players doing that. So he is unique. Whether he's number one, I don't know if I put him that high, but I'm glad to see that, he's sort of he normally doesn't make the top five of these lists. So it's good to see him getting credence, although we're sort of Queen to death these days, aren't we? They're so ubiquitous everywhere. Their music is kind of overplayed, at least the classic, say, top five, six Queen songs. Number two is normally everyone's number one. I don't think I've seen a list where it isn't number one. So this is the first time. Of course, that's Jimmy. And I think Jimmy's sort of position as the number one guitarist of all time isn't necessarily because he is the greatest guitarist of all time. It's really impossible to say that, isn't it? Because it's so subjective. It's his placement in history. It's where he comes in history. He's a pioneer who creates a style and an approach to the guitar that hadn't been seen prior to his arrival on the scene. And I think that it's the timing of his appearance in the guitar world that sort of pushes him to the forefront, and the fact that he broke conventions so severely at the time he appeared. Even the great guitar gods of the period, like Clapton, were gobsmacked, at just how great he was. However, he probably doesn't have the range of some guitar players that are below him. Not even people like Brian May, who in this list is number one, probably has more range in terms of sounds that he produces and the type of compositions than Hendrix. Although Hendrix, you can't fault anyone putting him high on the list. Number three is normally everybody's number two, which is Jimmy Page. There's a lot. There's sort of a knockback on Jimmy Page, isn't there? Because he is sloppy at times, and he does sort of rely on various guitar solo tropes that you hear sort of reused over and over again in his playing. I would say he's not as unique as the two players above him. However, people don't realize, well, all of you who are into classic rock realize, but a lot of sort of casual music listeners don't realize how many recordings this guy was on outside of the Led Zeppelin oeuvre. I mean, he was a session musician for years, the go-to guy on many, many top recordings, where he played a lot of different styles. So maybe he doesn't get the credit. People sort of judge him from his period in the Yardbirds and Led Zeppelin and don't really think about his work outside of that. but normally he's in the top 5, so I'm not surprised to see him here. At number 4, somebody who's always in the top 10, usually top 5, is Van Halen. And I think Van Halen, a little bit like Hendrix, also is valued so high just for his pioneering as well. He sort of broke the mold and introduced new techniques to guitar playing at a time where maybe guitar playing was getting a bit samey, a bit stale. He comes in with, you know, a sound and an approach and a technical array of feats that just had turned everybody's head. However, I wouldn't say that Van Halen necessarily produced the great music of the period. Maybe you could say the first album or two, but they produce a lot of musical tat as well. So maybe his compositional offering is not as high as, say, some of the others as well. However, his solo work and, of course, his technical virtuosity inspired legions of guitars to come. He kind of deserves his spot in the top 5 and was great. I heard him just a couple of years before he passed on, doing something on YouTube, and he was still just as great as he ever was. However, his tricks had kind of become expected at that time. They were no longer surprising. Whereas in the early years, he had the element of surprise just in his approach and his technical virtuosity. 5, coming in a bit lower than he normally does, is Clapton. Good old slow hand. And you know, this will divide people. Some people subscribe to the Clapton is God thing, and other people say, well, he kind of plays in boxes. He is not virtuosic around the guitar neck. He's very much blues based. He sticks with the pentatonic scale, and he's good at what he does, but he's not the sort of innovator that you know, some of these other guys are. And that would be a fair enough assessment. But for pure tone, I think, and making the guitar sing, I think he deserves to be up there. He's not in my top 5, but I can appreciate why he holds the position that he holds. And before Hendrix came along, he was the one everybody was looking at, the whiz kid on the street. So if, say, Hendrix hadn't happened, Clapton would have probably gone down as the greatest player of that particular period. And of course, he ceded the position to Hendrix himself. You know, he himself always said that Hendrix was better. Similarly, at number 6, and always in the top 10, but sort of variants with different people, is Gilmour. And Gilmour, like Clapton, is a great lyricist when it comes to the guitar. Melodic, smooth, beautiful lines, melodic lines. You know, maybe doesn't play at 100 miles an hour like a lot of the other guys, but certainly has tone for days, and is iconic in his sound. When you hear Gilmour approach the guitar, you very much know that it's him. So again, maybe not as technically virtuosic as some of the others, but in terms of pure sound, and I'm talking about acoustic sound as well. He was no slouch in playing sort of rhythm and acoustic lines, finger-picked lines, as well as guitar solos. Number 7, always floating in the top 10, but tends to be undervalued by a lot of people, I think, is Ritchie Blackmore, who, you know, back in the early Deep Purple days, I think there was a shout for him being probably the top guitar player of his period, simply because he could go beyond the sort of pentatonic blues lines and play other musical traditions. You know, of course, he's now in a sort of English folk band. Was it Blackmore's Night? And always had that sort of folky, classical underpinning to his playing that other players of his period didn't have. So he had sort of a weapon in his arsenal. You know, he could do a little bit of Baroque, he could do a little bit of classically inspired, but either solo or chordal work that influenced a lot of people after him. namely Yngwie Malmsteen definitely was influenced by him with his neoclassical playing. So deserves his spot there, I think, and often is rated too low, in my opinion. Number 8, it's nice to see Alex Lifeson get a spot in the top 10. He doesn't always come as high as number 8. There's a sort of a meme, isn't there, when people start talking about guitarists, it's like, don't underrate Alex Lifeson. Rush wasn't all about Geddy Lee and Neil Peart. Alex could hang with them and was a damn good guitar player, and also had quite range. He wasn't the fastest or inspiring in terms of his solo playing, but built great structures along with those very incremental drum sequences coming from Peart. You got to be a good player to play with somebody as complex as Geddy Lee and Neil Peart. So, definitely one of the top prog guitar players. And I think prog guitar players as a group get underrated. There's very few on this list. Very few. And there's probably 50 really, really excellent prog guitar players from the 70s and 80s that just get overlooked. So good to see him getting his due in this particular list. Number 9, way too low for me, is the poet of guitar playing. That's Jeff Beck, who we just lost. Who also was all about tone, melody, sound, soundscaping. Probably had a lot more range in terms of technique than some of these players that just play fast. There's no other way to say it. He was the poet of guitar players, and was up until the time he died. Some of the late recordings that he does, that you can find on YouTube, even in his latter years, I mean, he was incredible. And his technique of playing with the tremolo bar is unmatched, in my opinion. Not dive bombing, but using it in a nuanced way to sort of tone shift between notes. He's a very glidey player, is Jeff Beck. So 9's a bit low for me on this list. I think he's probably in my top 5. Number 10, I don't understand at all. He's not a bad guitar player, but I don't see why he's rated so high. I think he's rather middling in terms of where he fits in the guitar playing world, and that's Slash. Not a bad guitar player, but very average in terms of 80s, 90s metal rock guitarists. Not a whole lot of range to his playing. If you listen to his solos, he repeats his patterns a lot. He plays sort of in blues boxes and the pentatonic scale boxes. Doesn't play a whole lot of chromaticism. He's definitely sort of an extension of the guys that sort of electrified the blues lines through the 60s and 70s. And not a bad guitar player, and very important for the explosion of Guns N' Roses in the late 80s, which didn't last, in my opinion. They weren't around that long. Iconic in his look and his style and his presentation, but perhaps not this high for me in his playing. I'll do a few more because I'm having fun. Carlos Santana's also someone I can apply that mentality to as well. In terms of his music production, in terms of the compositions, they are varied and they do involve a lot of cultural underpinnings from Latin American, African music. But in terms of just his playing, it is like Slash, like Gilmour, sort of limited in the sense that he's good at what he does and he doesn't really go outside of what he does. If you listen to his solo playing, it's sort of contained in a narrow window. It's lovely, it's enjoyable, but he doesn't have the sort of range that a lot of these other guitarists have. Mark Knopfler comes in at number 12. Some people would rate him a lot higher than that, purely because he's a fingerstyle player playing electric guitar. He has a unique approach and gets a completely different tone than a lot of the other players. For instance, I think he stands out more than Slash, who's above him on this list. Just the way he plays the guitar and the kind of compositions he comes up with too are very different from the most of the rock oeuvre. So I think maybe a bit low for Mark Knopfler. I think he's a pioneer, kind of like Jeff Beck in terms of soundscaping and tones. Maybe doesn't have the range of compositions as someone like Jeff Beck. Number 13 is Angus Young, who I will, sort of say the same thing as Slash, but slightly, I think he's slightly better. It's all pretty stock, sort of 70s guitar lines, isn't it? There's not a whole lot of range, but damn good at what he does, and just a little dynamite of a player. And inspired a lot of people. Whether he should be this high on the list, I don't know. 14, Gary Moore, who was a brilliant player, probably had more range than a lot of the players just above him, in that he could play virtuoso jazz lines. He could play hard rock. He could play sort of proggy stuff as well. Definitely not just limited to sort of blues riffs. Was in the old Skid Row, was in Thin Lizzy, played a lot of solo work. Probably deserves a bit more credit than he gets. 15 is Billy Gibbons, who you could be forgiven for just judging him from his ZZ Top stuff, but he's done a lot of other stuff too. I would say that he is one of these players that tends to stay in the same sort of zone musically, sort of adapting blues to his own particular style. But I would say that he probably has a bit more range in his approach to that style than, say, someone like Slash. I think, he's a bit more nuanced and crafty of a player, and has more sounds in his arsenal. So that's the top 15. There are a lot of people missing, of course. Frank Zappa, you might be wondering where he is. Pete Townsend normally is in the top 15. Sometimes Lindsey Buckingham gets up there. Frampton, and many, many, many others. But, it's interesting that usually when you look at these top guitarists lists, it's always the same sort of half dozen players that make it into the top 15, that never move out of them. And there are certain great guitar players, like, where is John McLaughlin? Where's Mike Oldfield? Where are people like that? There are certain guitar players that have been unique, brilliant, technically interesting, that never make these top lists at all. I applied that to the prog guitarists early. I mean, there's a slew of them. Where are they on these lists? But also you could talk about, fingerstyle guitar players, Tommy Emmanuel or Leo Kottke, or anyone from that tradition, Michael Hedges. Well, what about Paco de Lucia, who blows away most of these guys in terms of range and technique. So it's interesting that we have sort of a mentality that these guys compose the canon of great guitarists, and no one can break in. It's sort of set. And that's what a canon is, isn't it? It's a set idea, cultural exception of an idea, and it's always, Hendrix, Clapton, Page, Van Halen, and, sort of this very set idea of what makes great guitarists. So I like to see this distinctions between lists, but then I always think, these people who put together these lists are not listening to the full spectrum of guitar music. There's a lot of guitar music out there that they're not covering when they're assessing great guitar players. So anyway, that's my waffle on that. Give me your opinions. I'm always interested in what you have to say, particularly about music and players. And often you give me tips on people to go listen to, and I enjoy that. All right, folks. See you next time.